Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Decentering the Margins, Roots for Liberation. To help situate you, we're streaming to YouTube. We are live from fourth space, and we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And just so you know, here at fourth space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-create daily activities, examine research questions, projects, and development across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting, so any comments or questions you have there, please enter them into the chat. We'll do our best to get them to our panelists. And for those of you in the space, if you'd like to participate, just raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone to you so that everyone can hear. With all of that, it's very much my pleasure to hand it over to Concordia Public Scholar, PhD candidate in the Department of Education, Dalia Elsayed. Dalia, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. So Decentering the Margins, Roots for Liberation proposes this methodological and ideological shift. Instead of maintaining sort of a central mainstream perspective, the focus is on acknowledging and amplifying the voices and experiences of those on the margins, while critically reflecting on the movement from margin to center, which can potentially reproduce new elements of power. The goal is to identify and implement effective and sustainable routes for strategies that lead to the liberation of marginalized groups from systemic oppression, fostering a more inclusive and equitable society. This approach encourages a broader understanding of diverse experiences and challenges the status quo by actively working towards social justice and equality. So the first session today will explore various concepts in relation to feminist epistemology, focusing specifically on standpoint epistemology, epistemologies of resistance, and Black feminist theory. This workshop is part of a larger Canadian Heritage-funded workshop, Unveiling Equity, so it's also a continuation of yesterday's conversation on structural racism. This is also part of a series that is being developed in collaboration with INRS, Institut National de Recherche Scientifique. I'm very proud of myself for saying that. So the continuation of events will happen the rest of the semester in April and at end of March as well. So stay updated. We'll update everyone with future events that are coming up. So just to introduce my speakers here, Lina Abdelrahim from University of Toronto. Lina is completing her PhD in philosophy at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on the differences that social location makes to knowledge, particularly exploring the questions of the knowledge that arises in context of marginalization, and why is it that this knowledge resists being shared across social context. And we have Marliane Lopez. Marliane is a Black feminist community organizer, tackling issues surrounding anti-Blackness, gender-based violence, and its intersections. She coordinated the EDI Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Division for the Quebec Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers, where she did advocacy work and raises awareness on how gender, race, class, and ability intersect in the context of sexual violence. She has also organized with movements such as Black Lives Matters around issues such as racial profiling and police brutality. Marliane was co-vice president for La Fédération des Femmes de Québec from 2017 to 2022, and is currently community engagement and outreach coordinator at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. She's also a co-founding member of the Coalition to Defund the SPVM and co-founder of Harambek, Reviving the Black Feminist Collective. So today's conversation, I wanted to start off by Lina. Lina, could you start us off by telling us what we mean when we say Black feminist epistemology, or specifically standpoint epistemology?
Sure. Thank you for having us here, first of all. To be brief, standpoint epistemology kind of focuses on this idea that your social location makes a difference to the kinds of things that you know, and it makes a difference to our knowledge practices in general. So in the context of feminist critique, standpoint epistemology kind of started off trying to understand how gender specifically impacts our knowledge acquisition practices. And of course, later theorists, we have Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and they kind of took on standpoint epistemology and focused on oppression in general. So of course, they moved away from just looking at gender and looking instead at how social location just in general, power dynamics in general, how do they impact our knowledge systems? And so this kind of defines or led to standpoint epistemology as being defined by three main ideas. So the main idea, the first of these ideas is what I've been mentioning so far, is that us as knowers, we're all situated. We all have particular social locations, and those make a huge difference to the kinds of things we know. That's the main idea that you hear. The second is that there are particular kinds of knowledge that are only accessible from certain social locations. They're only accessible from locations of social marginalization. And the third idea is that this kind of knowledge isn't something that you automatically have in virtue of your social identity. It's something that you kind of come to achieve. You come to achieve a standpoint, a perspective on our social realities.
So in that sense of achievement, and you mentioned that standpoint is achieved and not automatically given. So in that sense, not everyone has access to standpoint, even if they belong to marginalized communities.
That is correct. I mean, that's not to say that your social location doesn't change how you look at the world. Of course it does. But oftentimes it's in coming together with others, sharing our experiences, that we kind of come to understand the patterns in our experiences. So let's take, for example, the term microaggression. So the term is relatively new, and you can imagine that before it was a mainstream term, a lot of people kind of had these everyday slights, feeling uncomfortable in certain situations, but not really having the language necessarily to put, to explain what it is that they're experiencing. And so it's only through people coming together and recognizing, you know what, I've also felt discomfort in similar circumstances. Maybe this is actually a social phenomenon and maybe we should put a word to it. And then something like the term microaggression comes to fruition, and people start to be able to describe their experiences, to look at their experiences through these new concepts. And so it's very much a thing that you achieve, which is why, and it's important that it's something that's achieved, because standpoint epistemology is often kind of criticized of being essentialist. Especially in academic contexts, there's this idea that, well, what do you mean oppression can give you knowledge? You're kind of ignoring that not, for example, every Black woman has the same experience, and not every Black woman is going to have the same perspectives. So yeah, that's why it's something that's achieved.
Okay, thank you, Lena. So you mentioned experience as a starting place, as a very important starting place. So this brings us to Marlianne's work. Your work highlights the importance of lived experiences in understanding how prejudice impacts the lives of marginalized communities, specifically Black communities. Can you speak to the role of this experience in understanding the lives of Black communities or marginalized communities?
Thank you. I just wanted to pick off a bit where you left off, because I find it so interesting how academic theorists and academia in general says that standpoint epistemology can be essentializing, or how, you know, our perspectives, if we value it as knowledge, would be essentializing, but haven't they been essentializing us forever? And framing us as objects of study. So I just find it fascinating, this whole debate within academia. But coming to your question, I guess for me, it's always been about my, you know, the experience. I'm an organizer, so what motivates me, what's pushed me, what's mobilized me have been my experience. What's moved me to learn from other marginalized communities has been my experience. And I guess that's something that's pretty much of a given within community organizing. But the way that knowledge or those experiences are extracted within spaces of power, where power relations are evident, is something that we rarely talk about. And that's why I think this conversation is super valuable, because as organizers, we've always been, I believe, like in dialogue with Black feminist intellectuals, Black feminist theorists. And I sometimes, like, I believe that we, as organizers, we also theorize unintentionally. We believe that we're positioned, we're socially positioned not to be able to do that. But if you see that exchange that happens between Black feminist organizers, and has happened over the decades and years, and Black feminist organizers, there is a true like dialogue and exchange. And that's how I believe that theorizing took place. And I think that that's something that we need to value and to highlight.
And how does Black feminism specifically as a practice guide these processes of resistance in your work and your community organizing, or in the spaces that you occupy here at Concordia, at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute?
So as we were saying, our social positioning puts us in a unique place to be able to understand certain power dynamics, and not just from the perspective as a group that is marginalized or oppressed, but also from like looking at the oppressor. And so I think that Black feminist thought, Black feminist organizing puts us in that place to like truly understand and be able to develop resistance strategies to address these power dynamics and oppression.
Okay. And maybe this is a question that I want to put out to both of you, is that how does Black feminist theory, standpoint epistemology, shed light in the ways that knowledge is constructed? In other words, how does it challenge dominant perspectives on knowledge? How does it challenge the idea of what we know and who is telling us what we know, who's in control of those spaces?
Sure, yeah. So from a philosophy perspective specifically, traditionally when people are studying knowledge, historically they've looked at knowers as being kind of individuals who are not socially situated and are disembodied in a way. So you have this really abstract way of trying to understand knowledge that doesn't at all look at power dynamics. And but later on, you kind of had feminist epistemologists coming along and saying, you know what, we need to locate people in their social circumstances. And it's only once we look at how knowledge is socially constructed that we can bring in those power dynamics. And it's important because historically, we've only looked at power dynamics as being like a messy empirical fact that theory can only, touch on in a really, really vague way. But now what we're finding out is that no, social power dynamics have a very predictable impact on knowledge. And it's also really important because it means that not only do we have knowledge arising in these contexts, but it seems like there's this difficulty where this knowledge, no matter how hard or how much we try to frame it, it doesn't get taken up by people who are in more privileged social positions. So the idea seems to be that there are structural issues. It's not that people are just unwilling to listen, but it seems like there's something that's preventing them also from listening. This is not to say that we're not all responsible, of course, for educating ourselves on the things that we lack knowledge on. But that is to say that the issue is much, much deeper.
And how does it how do you navigate those spaces where these forms of knowledges are not necessarily accepted and there's resistance to those knowledges, specifically in academic spaces or spaces where we're trying to connect theory and practice? How do you navigate that tension both in your work and in your work in the academy between dominant knowledges and marginalized or alternative forms of knowledge?
So I think to speak again to philosophy specifically, lately there's a movement in philosophy of race specifically, and in Black feminist philosophy, where people are trying to engage more with the communities about which they're theorizing. So rather than just coming along and saying, okay, there seems to be a way that people who are socially positioned in a certain way tend to be silenced. So how can we work with people who are actually actively working in the community? And how do we build theoretical tools that enable them to frame the things that they want to say? So it's interesting because we kind of look at ourselves as producing the next big idea or criticizing heavily. But what we really need to recognize is that there's actually so much knowledge already out there, but we struggle to bring it into the academy. And for that reason, we need to question our own structures that make it impossible for us to bring it in or make it difficult for us to do that. But standpoint epistemologists in general, they emphasize starting our theorizing with the lives of those who are marginalized, because if we can't start our theorizing there, then there's a lot that we're always going to leave out. That can't be an afterthought.
And Marliane, how do you also navigate that move towards working with communities? Academics are interested now in working with communities. There's all these grants that encourage that kind of work. How do you navigate the extractive nature of research, right? And how do you sort of say, no, this is not what we're doing here, and this is the community that you're probably very protective of, right? So how do you navigate that sort of dynamic?
So yeah, so as someone who works in academia without being an academic and that works more in community spaces, I do think that I've seen change, because when I was in university, we didn't have community members or organizers coming in, giving lectures. And so this is something that I consider to be quite new. And so I guess that there is the acknowledgement that what comes with this community-based knowledge is, knowledge that is important to academia. The problem is that the relationship that we have with academia continues to be highly extractive. And we see it. We see universities that, failing to hire, like if we're just talking about feminist scholars, failing to hire Black feminist scholars or professors in tenure track positions, especially here in Quebec, you see it a lot.
Absolutely.
You see a lot of Black feminist intellectual scholars just giving courses informally, struggling to get a course load each semester without being able to access tenure track positions. And, let's talk about a Black studies program. There's still no commitment, or, it hasn't been how do you say in English? Concrétisé. And, you still have students, organizers, and scholars fighting to have, Black studies programs in Quebecois and Canadian universities. And so there has been progress in terms of acknowledging what's coming from our experiences, or our standpoint is knowledge, but the extractive nature is still there. And, unfortunately, you do see how some academics, since they're wanting to teach upon race, upon Black feminist thought, they need to call on community members to come and give lectures because they don't feel legitimate in teaching these texts.
Okay.
And so how do we go about this? Because usually the way that this happens is to my mind, highly disrespectful. They get a small honorarium to come teach what the professor is supposed to be teaching. And so I think these are conversations that need to be had, but above all, academic institutions need to really act instead of, all the performative, actions that appear like long-term actions, to really recognize this knowledge as scientific knowledge and fund Black studies.
Absolutely. So, Lena, perhaps we can talk a little bit to the idea of theorization. So how does this kind of theorization actually work in practice, right? we're talking about the role of community and how academics are expanding beyond the formal institution to involve communities a little bit more. And it seems that there's a lot of work being done, but oftentimes it sits behind a paywall. So how do you think it can be framed in ways that it's more useful for approaching and working with communities?
I'll speak about a couple of examples from what I'm seeing around me. So the philosopher Christy Dotson, who's kind of responsible for bringing race into the conversation in epistemology specifically, she only works directly with community organizers, with sociologists, and tries to understand from them what it is that they're seeing around them, what it is that they're trying to explain, and what kind of theoretical tools they think would be of use to them. And then she kind of goes away, does the research, and tries to come up with a framework that is of use both in practice and that in an educational setting informs us on what's going on out there. The other thing is philosophy as a discipline is extremely inaccessible. But if you think about it, philosophy is something that we all do. We all ask ourselves these questions about our reality, the nature of our existence, social structures. These are questions that we've all asked at some point in some way. So you also have people who are specifically, like Brianna Toole is a philosopher who has a program called Corrupt the Youth. And what she does is she engages directly with high school students, middle school students, and tries to get them to be interested in philosophy so that we can have, so the problem again is that philosophy is an extremely white discipline.
Right.
It's also a very male discipline, but as a result of that, the issues that matter to us are often not considered philosophical issues at all.
Right.
So Christy Dotson, for example, she has a paper called How is This Philosophy? And in that paper, she kind of interrogates this idea that even when we come to do this kind of work from a philosophical perspective, we're always facing this need to justify our work. We're always needing to tell people, no, this is actually philosophy too. This isn't just sociology. This isn't just us looking at data and trying to understand what's happening. No, it's when we're asking those deep questions about the nature of existence, how we're socially positioned is very much a part of that. And unless we can engage youth specifically, I don't think that can happen, because ultimately what we need is more people to whom these issues matter doing the work.
Right.
Yeah.
And is there some form of resistance in those academic spaces to accepting the strategies of working with communities, as you mentioned, the youth project? How are these projects accepted in academic spaces? Are they considered as part of a quote unquote rigorous approach to research, or are they still on the sidelines?
In some sense, they're still on the sidelines, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of engaging them. And that's because, I mean, if you look at the discipline of philosophy, first of all, it's only diverse at the undergrad level. And after that point, there's tends to be a huge drop-off. And until in philosophy, we can take seriously the idea that these questions are philosophical questions, I think there's little hope. But that being said, there are a lot of people out there who are doing this work, and feminist epistemology has only lately become a popular part of philosophy. But you're seeing more of these ideas being taught in introductory classes,
Right.
which I think is a positive sign. That being said,
Right. Okay.
not enough work is being done. And as you were saying, you know, when we do talk about these issues, it's often like a class at the end of the semester that most students aren't attending, and that the professor brings in like an external community member to teach. When I think these professors need to be taking responsibility as well and educating themselves on these matters. Why is it that
Absolutely.
we think that these are things that we need to bring in someone else to teach? Like,
Absolutely.
shouldn't you be educating yourself on these matters and engaging your students on these questions throughout the semester? That's what I have to say about that.
Absolutely.
I realized that there was that part of the question that I didn't answer about how to address that extractive nature of working with community members. And I feel like if we go to Black feminist theorists and intellectuals, a lot of them, were also community organizers.
Absolutely.
There was a big connection there. And so for me, it's always, important that academics or researchers that want to work on issues that involved communities that have been historically marginalized, there needs to be a relationship that is built, that is there. I see so many researchers and academics sometimes go in these, communities and just hop in with their research, and there's no relationship.
Absolutely.
And there's no trust.
Mhm.
And so that's why a lot of, unfortunately, that research is flawed or distorts a lot of times realities of marginalized communities. And so I think that relationship is super important for there to be respectful and non-extractive. And also what I see, for example, when I worked in community and there were projects that were led by researchers, for example, in the context of sexual violence, they would go and partner with community orgs that work on sexual violence and build like a committee of council committee to be able to extract that knowledge, because they had the funding, they had the funds, but they didn't have that knowledge. They didn't have that standpoint knowledge. And so they needed to build afterwards these, committees and, on the basis of like, we're including you in this research and, it's all benevolent. And then, extracting that knowledge and communities not getting the validation of that being an expertise. And so that's something that I still think we need to be really mindful of and resist.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up an important point about traditionally and historically, Black feminists have been very involved in community. And I think that comes from the need to rely on community for support, right? Because these spaces are not traditionally designed for us. They're not necessarily meant for us. So there's this heavy reliance on the knowledge that comes from community, from people who experience the same experiences as you, because there's a sense of someone is validating my experience, right? And this is not happening in some sort of vacuum. And that kind of also brings me to this, the idea of Ubuntu, which is the African philosophy, and in Bantu, it sort of just simply means humanity. But the idea is that I am because we are, right? So I am who I am as a Black feminist theorist, as a Black feminist scholar, because of my community and because of the people I engage with, and specifically the experiences that we often are very in conversation about, specifically amongst our specific communities. So I wanted to ask specifically to the role of, perhaps to speak to the role of Harambek, the Black Feminist Collective, and how the revival of such a collective or such a concept is important in the context of modern day Quebec or Montreal in general.
So a lot of the work that we're doing now early on is linked to knowledge transmission and archival work because of the systemic erasure of Black feminist contributions, whether it be to academia or even when I was an organizer with, rape crisis centers, I didn't learn about any Black women who organized before me. And I know that they existed. And so for us, it's really important to take time to unearth all those contributions. And that's why we fortunately will work with an archivist who is really connected to different Black communities here. And we are taking time to, have conversations, intergenerational conversations, so we don't position ourselves, because a lot of times, others position us as, something new, like the first time, like they love positioning Black people as the first, and this and that. And so we resist that really strongly, because we know that we have, pioneers before us that have been doing this work forever, and that unfortunately we just don't have access to their work, because even what we considered information we're archiving. Like when we talk about archiving in our community, it's like, sometimes it's like, but people don't know that they have rich archival material in their own homes, like everyone does. And so I think that's important work that we're doing right now. And also at the same time, working to center the margins, even within what we call, the group Black women. There's still, marginalized folks within that group. And that for us is that's really important, because we also tend to center dominant discourses or dominant experiences within marginalized groups.
Absolutely.
And that's something that we really want to resist. And so I guess it's also from a point of view, it's helpful that it was co-founded by 3 queer women. And for us, it's really important to center the experience, not only of Black women, Black queer women, but also non-binary folk. And so it's, that's to answer your question.
So this kind of leads us to the conversation about surrounding privilege and how we as members of marginalized communities or marginalized groups occupy various spaces of privilege and marginalization at the same time. Yes, we might belong to a Black community that is historically marginalized, but at the same time, we're having this conversation within the confines of the academy. So we're very close to an intellectual, scholarly center as well. So in the pursuit of decentering the mainstream, which is the idea that we wanted to discuss and elaborate on through this workshop series, how do we avoid unintentionally creating these new centers of power within our own marginalized communities?
This is a really difficult question. But I mean, one thing that we also need to pay attention to is that just because we're in these communities, these communities do select for privilege of a certain kind. So one thing that I've noticed personally is the longer I've been in philosophy, the more I try to frame my work in a way that fits in pre-existing philosophical structures or structures that are accepted in philosophy. And it's really difficult to notice as you're going along. It's only when you're stepping outside and having these conversations about the work that you're doing with people in the community that you start to realize sometimes that you're actually moving so far away from the goal that initially, or the motivation that you had in the beginning. And so that's why I think conversations like these are important. But I also think cross-disciplinary work is really important for that reason, because the more you kind of are forced to communicate your work with an audience who isn't just, reading philosophy all day or reading sociology all day, the more you kind of remember what it was that got you there in the first place. So for me, it's mostly cross-disciplinary work.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is, as members of communities that have been historically and continue to be marginalized, it's important that we acknowledge our own positioning and also like mobility, because, my experience have changed over the years also with social mobility. And now, I work within academia, and it's really important that I am disciplined in remembering that, the experiences that I see within academia are not always, they're not the same as what's happening, outside. And so it's important for me to be connected to the communities that I aim to work with and represent, because if not, you can easily get disconnected and easily become comfortable in certain spaces. And once you get access to, certain academic spaces or spaces of decision-making, I think it's really important that that exercise or that discipline is there. So we're all, and always acknowledging who's not around, who's not at the table where decisions are being made. And, it's something, I guess, like I've always said, my experiences help me do that. Because, for example, something that I really always like to bring up when I'm in spaces where we're talking about policing in schools, for example, and we talk about policing and racism in schools, but we fail to have like a class and a disability justice perspective around that issue. But because of my experiences having, a child with a disability, it's something that I bring to the table every time I'm in a space where we're talking about racism in school or policing in schools. And so that positioning helps me to bring that perspective. And so that's why it's really important that we acknowledge who's not around the table, because a lot of times if those folks are not around, we're not going to have the, it's going to be always an afterthought.
Right.
And so I think those are some of the strategies or some of the things that enable us to be mindful of those issues.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned earlier something that I wanted to talk about a little bit, is that the role of intergenerational connectedness, right? So if you can speak to why is it important for us as young scholars, young academics, young community organizers, and as Black women to connect with the people who came behind us, specifically in this social location and social context.
Because whiteness has an ability to make you think that it's never been done before. And that's really, really harmful to our communities. And so for me, it's important to be in direct contact and relationship with my elders, because that knowledge transmission is important in terms of forming our identity, working around our strategies, learning what worked, what didn't work, so we don't make the same mistakes. And just, as a humble human being, just acknowledging that there were a lot of people before me,
Right.
Fighting this fight and the struggle, and there's something to learn. I come from a culture that really values the knowledge of elders. And, capitalism is something that has completely eroded this, like the value of knowledge coming from, our elders, but it's something that, our communities have resisted. And I sincerely hope that we continue to, and have these spaces, like intergenerational spaces of dialogue, I find to be highly transformative, not just for the youth, but also for the elders. And so I think it's,
Yeah, just to add to that, what you mentioned about forgetting that this work has been done before, or whiteness's ability to make you forget that. And just to recount one of my experiences, when I first came across feminist epistemology, it was an important moment for me, because it was only then that I noticed that knowledge could be studied in this social way. I hadn't heard that in any of my graduate courses. But then later, someone gave me a copy of the book, This Bridge Called My Back. And I realized that these ideas that are in the feminist epistemology literature, the same themes run through that whole book. Like, the book has the seeds of many of these ideas, but nowhere were they mentioned in the feminist epistemology literature. And it's only now that people are starting to make those connections and starting to realize that people have been saying this for a long time.
Right.
So why has it taken so long to make it to the academy? And why, when it does make it to the academy, do we act like it's a new thing? Why can't we acknowledge the roots of it?
Right. There is also this co-optation of Black knowledges that I think you both touched upon a little bit. So how does the role of Black scholars in these spaces and Black community organizers lead to a space where we can acknowledge Black knowledge, acknowledge that it has always existed and will always exist? And then also, how do we point out to these co-optations of knowledge? I mean, intersectionality right now is a buzzword that's floating in every academic space, but a lot of times when it's spoken about, we forget the likes of Patricia Hull Collins, and we forget Kimberly Crenshaw, and we forget all the Black feminist theorizing that has been taking place since the 60s, speaking specifically to this issue. So how do you deal with that co-optation of knowledge?
I think you need to deal with it like on different fronts. in terms of popular education, from my positioning, when I'm invited to do workshops, I try to, raise awareness on that. Like here in Quebec, I remember when, like years ago, I started to be invited to give like workshops on what is intersectionality. The first thing I would ask, the participants is like, where does this term come from? And nobody would know. They would know the term intersectionality, but they wouldn't know that it, who it was coined by, or, the rich heritage of, Black feminist thought, nothing. And so, that's a way through popular education that I try to, resist that. But like it has to be on many fronts. And here, I think there needs to be, like, we can't lower our guard because, sometimes, like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of, performativity just, to make you think that, yeah, we're addressing your concerns, but not really, or we're not going to commit with, with money to like what you're asking for. And so then there's instead, let's just continue this co-optation and extracting from community. And instead of committing to actually building like programs and, minors, majors, departments, we're just going to continue like calling on Black feminists, whether they be organizers or scholars, as temporary, professors, part-time professors, and not tenure track positions. And, giving students that knowledge that they are asking for, but not keeping Black scholars in precarious situations. And so I think it's important to, within academia, to continue resisting that, and outside also. And from outside, talking about this extraction and, developing strategies, because a lot of times, I know that we've been in situations that we've accepted, to come into classrooms because we know, for one, we know that there's Black students in there, that if we don't go in, they won't, benefit from learning or, hearing from these experiences. But then there's also, we're in precarious situations a lot of times, and sometimes we need to accept that paycheck. And so it's having these conversations from outside also, and developing strategies. So, this doesn't continue to fuel this systemic problem, which is, the erasure of Black knowledges, or the co-optation of Black knowledges without giving it the appropriate validation, and, keeping Black scholars in very precarious situations.
Absolutely. And maybe to jump into the last segment or question for this session, you spoke a little bit about cross-disciplinary collaborations, specifically in philosophy right now, but I don't know to what extent does that take place, because you see a lot of collaboration in disciplines like education, for example, but in philosophy, you notice that a lot of it is kind of created within the silos and departments of philosophy. So I wanted to ask the question for both of you: how do you think solidarities, alliances, collaborations strengthen the impact of Black feminists, standpoint theorists, and Black feminist organizing?
Personally, I think that collaborations are important because they help keep the work relevant and up to date. So philosophers can spend a lot of time thinking about an issue, and just thinking about this idea that it took so long for us to acknowledge that social location makes an impact on knowledge is in itself, oftentimes when I'm talking to people in the world about what it is that we're trying to establish in philosophy, it's something that to many people is just obvious. Obviously, I have experience that gives me certain knowledge about marginalization. Obviously, I know what it's like to live in the world as a Black woman. So why are these things that on one hand seem so obvious to us seem so questionable in an academic context? And I think here is where we need to be focusing on engaging with not only other disciplines, but also engaging work that's not considered academic work.
Right.
So for example, in my work, I try to refer to a lot of literature that talks about these experiences. I look at op-ed articles. I look at ideas in places that traditionally we wouldn't look for them, because
Right.
that's where you find the more relevant work.
And I think we need to question what we truly mean when we say academic work or scientific work, because academia won't validate it as being academic, but at the same time, they need it when engaging on certain, theoretical texts and stuff. So it's something that, like I always say, I'm the first one to say, I'm not an academic, but at the same time, why am I always being invited to classes? So it's something I think we need to, like, and even in terms of decolonizing, academia, if it's possible.
You don't seem so optimistic.
I don't know. But so yeah, collaborations, I would ask, like, between, it depends, like, with who. Like, for me, it's always important to, that's, you can't just collaborate with anyone.
Absolutely.
So it depends. Like, if I come back to the beginning of the conversation when we were speaking on, how we tend to create like a dichotomy with theory and practice, and how like Black feminist intellectuals have informed, organizers in terms of, providing certain language, not to say that organizers don't have the capacity, or communities that are marginalized don't have the capacity to articulate their experience, but I believe that there's always been like a communication between organizers in, precarious communities and intellectuals and theorists. And maybe I had thought about a quote from citation from Bell Hooks that I'm going to read because I'm not able to memorize citations. But Bell Hooks wrote, "When our lived experiences of theorizing is fundamentally linked to processes of self-recovery, of collective liberation, no gap exists between theory and practice. Indeed, what such experience makes more evident is the bond between the two, that ultimately reciprocal process wherein one enables the other." So for me, a lot of her work speaks towards this dynamic.
Absolutely. And I think that's a perfect place to sort of transition us to the Q&A, because this reminds us of the specific role and the spaces that we occupy, right? We transition between community and center, and we have a specific, or center and community, exactly. And we have a specific role as Black women in academia, and sort of a different, at times, what feels like a different responsibility to our communities. So how can we best serve our communities from that position of center? And that idea of collaboration and cross-disciplinary knowledge kind of speaks specifically to that. So thank you. All right.
Thank you.
So now we can move to Q&A.
I just want to start off by saying thank you for simply being. That was wonderful. I really liked it. My positionality is I was born and raised in post-apartheid South Africa, so I really appreciate you saying Ubuntu, because that's the foundations that I think of. And because of my experience being born and raised in South Africa, I have to acknowledge that it's been 124 days since October 7th, and Gaza is still bleeding. I am also of Congolese ethnicity, specifically from the Kivu provinces that are experiencing the militia of the Rwandan genocide of the M23, actually. And because of all the generational trauma that comes with me just simply being, I've been finding myself fascinated with how mental illnesses or mental disabilities, other disabilities, are used to devalue the work of Black academics or just people in general speaking about certain issues, and how they also undervalue some of our like wisdoms, because I also do appreciate speaking to my elders. I speak to them daily, and a lot of the things I see, I'm just like, they already taught me this. But the schools don't recognize African philosophy. They don't recognize any of these things. So I know it's going to come to that point one day. But to go back to what I was saying, have you guys also noticed how mental illnesses or mental just mental health has been used to devalue some of your work. Thank you.
I'm not sure that I can speak to that specifically, but what I will say is that often when these issues are brought up in a philosophical context, I'll have people like philosophy is very heavy on examples. So whenever philosophers are trying to explain something theoretically, they'll give you a thought experiment, an example of some sort. And I noticed that oftentimes if the example that I give is racially charged or touches on power dynamics in any way, sometimes rather than people engaging with the question, I'll get an apology. I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, even if I wasn't, if this wasn't an experience that I personally had gone through. It's just a thought experiment that I'm presenting as something objective for us to discuss. But people can't necessarily, sometimes it seems like they can't take it seriously as just an academic pursuit, and rather they take it to be something about you and how you're doing in the world and what they should do about your feelings in that moment.
And that kind of belittles the experience a little bit, takes it out of the context.
And it also makes it impossible for us to discuss it in any critical way,
Right.
as something that makes a difference to our theoretical work. But I'm not sure if you have more to say about that.
Yeah, I think we could have a talk just on that issue. Our communities have, historically been pathologized, and, when we talk about mental health and intergenerational trauma, how many of what we consider academic texts exist written by members of our community on this issue, and how are these texts received within academia? That's, in itself a question when, the source of this mental health or, even other physical ailments is structural oppression and, histories of enslavement. And so it's a very, very important question. And I would just say that that's why it's important that as we fight and resist systemic racism, we can't lose view of other systems of oppression like ableism that target Black communities in a very specific way. And so I, for one, hope to see a lot of literature come in the future around ableism, disability justice in Black communities.
Other questions?
We do have a question here in the chat from Zaina. Zaina says, great insights. My question is about how much feminist theories are grounded in indigenous methodologies where self-location, relationally, and reciprocity are pillars to researching with and not about, and then says, sorry, I will not hear the answer, but we'll access later.
Maybe I can speak to that a little bit. I think feminist theorists and particularly Black feminist theories do rely heavily on that idea of reciprocity. I am not here to benefit from a certain community. I am here as someone who belongs to a community. I am here in conversation with my community to understand how exactly to engage in those conversations that are ideally going to lead us to liberation, right? How to re-engage in conversations about freedom. We're not here to extract, because specifically with Black feminist theorizing is it existed and it exists, and it came about particularly to address the nuances and the needs of Black women, the needs for their recognition, the need for their protection. And it addresses elements that are very important, I think, to our collective liberation as a society, not just as a Black society. And that in itself, I mean, if we look at Black feminism, and I often in my work refer to it as Black feminisms, because when we speak about Black feminism, we're speaking particularly about the form of knowledge that came about from American theorizing, right? But Black feminism at the same time is not very separate from various ideas and perceptions of Afrofeminisms, right? Which are ideas that address, these are indigenous methodologies. These are thoughts that came from a people, so it can address the needs of that society and that specific community.
Any other questions in the space? Yeah, okay, so we'll take another one from Zoom here from Esmeralda.
Hi, Esmeralda. Hi, Dr. Thornhill.
Esmeralda asked, would you kindly explain for us your meaning behind the chosen title, specifically decentering the margins? What do you mean by this phrase? Thank you.
I think the idea of this came about from in conversations about how we always have those conversations from a certain position of center, while at the same time belonging to intellectual margins or to social margins in general. So this idea is that us as academics and as people who occupy these academic spaces, we're still very much in the center. So how do we step away from that idea of center? How do we make our knowledge a little bit more accessible to the people that we speak about and to the people that we speak to? So how do we step away from also joining that center, that ivory tower in particular, and actually give voice to marginalized communities? Like, for example, you addressed a lot about how Black communities, Black feminist theorizing also needs to take into consideration other groups within that group who might experience racialization differently, who might experience sexism differently, who might experience ableism, right? So these conversations of, yes, I'm a Black woman, but my experience is that also I am a Black woman speaking from a specific center. So how do I take into consideration people who belong to these margins, who I am historically also part of?
And I might, if I can just add, I think these are conversations that are really important within communities that are marginalized, because a lot of times we have this conversation in terms of addressing, you know, whiteness, in terms of addressing colonialism. But like, when we have these conversations within a minoritized group or a historically oppressed group, we do need to also realize how we tend to center the majority or the dominant voices of that oppressed groups. And it's not just pertaining to one oppressed group. You see this dynamic in almost, I think, all of them, like whether it be, you know, in queer groups, whiteness is still dominant, you know. So I think it's important to also have this analysis and these conversations within groups that have been minoritized.
Absolutely.
So we don't reproduce the same dynamics when trying to lead these struggles, because if not, we're not gonna succeed. And
Absolutely.
Okay, we do have another question on Zoom here from Leon. Leon says, as a psychology student myself, I wonder what psychological frameworks can be analyzed to contribute to the discussion of decentralization and marginalization of visible minorities.
That might be difficult for me to answer because I don't come from that field, but if you can speak about that in context of philosophy, are you able to?
Yeah, I can speak to that in the context of philosophy. So in the context of philosophy, I think, first of all, feminist epistemology is a great contribution that enables us to discuss these things. But I think we also have the philosophy of race. In the philosophy of race, it's a growing discipline, and new frameworks are being created all the time. But I'm not sure that I can speak to psychology specifically.
Yeah, not our discipline.
Yeah.
We speak from the context, I think, of education, community organizing, and philosophy in particular. So I'm not necessarily familiar with psychology frameworks.
I will say, though, that individualism is probably one of the biggest theoretical roadblocks in terms of philosophy generally. So we just want to be looking at the ways that individualism infects our theorizing in general, because it can be so subtle. Sometimes you find yourself relying on a framework where you're starting from an individual as opposed to a socially situated person. And we all kind of have that bias in our thinking because of the educational systems in which we're embedded. So if there's one thing to pay attention to is to what extent am I centering an individualist framework? I think that's a really important one.
Thank you. Okay. Well, is that it on the Zoom questions? All right, well, thank you very much for coming. And we will share and advertise the remaining of these conversations, because I think this is sort of an inauguration of a longer conversation that we talk about centering specifically Black voices and specifically Black women, and coming up with ideas for collective liberation rather than individual liberation, right? So stay tuned for more. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to our public scholar, Dalia, for coming into the fourth space today and for activating this conversation. Everybody online and those of you in the space, thank you for your questions and your comments. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and the live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel, and if you'd like to revisit it or share it. So please join us again at